Hello and welcome to the Satire Fire podcast. I am your host of the day, Samuel.
And I'm not a host, but I'm Sydney.
Sydney is not a host. She's actually a member of the secret police.
Thought police.
Gotcha. Busted. This is the podcast where we get together once a week, every week, and talk about satirical books. This is going to be episode number 3 in our series on 1984 by George Orwell. If you missed our first 2 episodes, be sure to go back and check those out. Episode 1 is a plot summary of 1984 to get you caught up to speed if you have not read 1984 in a while. Episode 2 is a historical summary about George Orwell and 1984 so that you can understand the context of the time period in which 1984 was written to better understand 1984 as a book. And this is our first analysis episode, where essentially we're going to take all the things that we learned last week and use them to interpret the themes and messaging and ideas that we can find inside of 1984 to hopefully understand a little bit better. If you have felt like I have been talking a tremendous amount the past 2 episodes, luckily for you, Sydney gets to talk a lot more in this one as we peck her brain about what she feels are the most important themes and messages and things like that inside of 1984. But before we get into all of that, Sydney, have you been reading anything lately or watching anything lately or doing anything lately that you want to update us on?
Have I read anything lately? No, I've never read a book before, actually. So recently I listened to the audiobook of The House of My Mother, I think it's called. It's by Shari.
The House
Franke.
of My Mother.
And for those who don't know anything about the Franke family, they are a Mormon family who were family vloggers. And so it's a mom and a dad with 6 kids, and their channel was called 8 Passengers. And I never watched them, nor did I know anything about them really prior to all of this coming out. But the mother, Ruby Franke, as well as this woman who kind of entered them into this cult that's like a cult of Mormon people called Connections or something like that. Anyways, I don't want to speak on it a ton because I don't know a lot about that other than what was in the book. But essentially, this woman, Jody Hildebrandt, and then the mother, Ruby Franke, were arrested a couple years ago and charged with multiple counts of child neglect and abuse. And it just came out that they were doing horrific things to the 2 youngest children in that family, and the whole family in general it was just not a great situation. And they had made their entire living off of their family vlogging. And I think in around 2020 it came out, they posted a video, and in it Ruby had kind of let slip, or maybe one of the children let slip, that as a punishment one of the kids had to sleep on a beanbag on the floor for 6 months instead of in their bed. And so people started combing through previous videos and finding instances where they were like, oh, she seems to have some really harsh punishments like child abuse, what's going on? But nothing really came to light until a couple years later when they were arrested. Anyways,
I feel like I saw my boyfriend Poppy is really into I don't know if I would say that it's true crime. It's video essays and stuff like that about reality TV and the things that go on in reality TV. And I feel like I've been in the room while he watched a episode or mini-series about this family because this all sounds really familiar.
Yeah. Well, so it's a memoir written by the oldest daughter, Shari Franke, of that family, and just talking about her childhood, her upbringing, and then everything that led her to the point of, for the last year before her mother was arrested, she was kind of no contact with her mom and by extension her family. And yeah, it was really, I feel a little weird critiquing it, just because when someone's telling their story and it's a very sensitive story like that, I'm always you know what, this doesn't have to be perfectly written. It doesn't have to, this is your story. Who am I? I'm just some girl. But the one thing I will say that bothered me about it is that she's still Mormon, Shari, which I'm not saying anything. You can be religious. It's more so that she talks so much about the trauma that her religion caused her, and it felt like the whole book she was getting so close to acknowledging that. Like as an outsider listening, I was like, oh, it's very clear that your religion and the community you were in contributed to a lot of trauma you have. But she was just like stating these things and then not making that connection. And I felt a little weird about it. I was like, oh, I feel like maybe in a few years you'll maybe understand this more or something, you know?
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah, I don't know. It was really good is the wrong word. It was very interesting to listen to, and I respect her for the fierce protection she feels for her siblings and the things she's done. Like, she gives testimonies in Utah. She's been really involved in trying to get like restrictions on family vlogging passed in legislature, and she's advocating a lot for the safety and protection of children, and I think that's cool. And I you know, you could have come out of that and felt very differently, but she didn't, and she's very much taken her life offline as well, and I think that's, yeah.
Understandably.
Yeah. What have you been reading?
The most recent... I want to talk about the most recent 5-star book that I finished, which is the book Martyr by Kaveh Akbar, which I think technically, to pronounce the title correctly, I should be shouting it, but I don't feel like shouting on the podcast episode, so imagine me shouting the word martyr. I don't want to get too involved in what the book is about, because I think that everyone should read it. I think that it's an excellent book, and knowing less going in is probably better, but it's totally okay to, like, I'm just gonna go like broad strokes. Essentially, it's all centered around a person who is desperate to have lived at the end of their life, come to a conclusion of their life, and die with their life having meant something, and thus the idea of martyrhood, where this person is really interested in researching and looking into various historical martyr figures, as well as people who he believes could be considered modern day martyrs. And I think that this is just like a topic that I have gotten more interested in lately. Maybe not lately, but I've read a couple of books in a row that seem to be dealing with this idea of, like, what does it take for a life to have been well lived? I think the first book that I read that involved that topic, that concept, was Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers, which I also highly recommend if anybody is interested in this topic. Becky Chambers is a great writer. Check that book out. But this one comes at it from a different perspective that I really appreciated. And I think that that's all that I'm going to say about it. But yeah, if you get the chance, check out Martyr. If it helps to have a testimony, I know that this author and this book are both very much enjoyed by Tommy Orange, who wrote There There. So if you like Tommy Orange, you'll probably like Kaveh Akbar, because they're friends, apparently. But yeah, that's what I've been reading.
Legacy. What is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden you'll never get to see.
Sorry to Lin-Manuel Miranda post 2 episodes in a row, guys, but I guess that's really, where we're at.
Sorry, this is my fault. It's purely because of my presence on this podcast.
I think that gets us through a little bit of an introduction. Let's talk about what we're going to be doing today. So like I mentioned at the beginning, we've already talked about the plot of 1984, and we have talked about the history behind 1984. This week, we're going to be actually looking at the themes and things that stuck out to us while we were reading it that we think are interesting and are important and make this book potentially still relevant to people who are reading it today. So I think that I'm just going to like open it up. Like, Sydney, did you have any specific thing that you wanted to start the discussion with?
Yeah. Let's talk about sex.
Let's talk about sex, baby.
Ago, I think on the first episode that I really wanted to talk about sex, and I said to keep it on the mind, and Samuel said I was a freak, but I think that this is a theme in the book. Sex, sexuality. What does sex symbolize? And okay, so sex is not allowed in this world, and it is purely for the purpose of creating children. And we even mentioned there's a junior anti-sex league, which teenagers in Oceania can be a part of, that kind of promotes just anti-sex, anti-sexual freedom, anti-sexuality. No one is a sexual being inherently, and if they are, then that's a crime. And I just was thinking a lot about like what sex means, and also historically thinking about groups that are labeled with being more promiscuous or being more sexually aware. For example, the LGBTQ plus community. And being in touch with your sexuality. And that doesn't just mean like, do you want to have sex with men, or do you want to have sex with women, or do you want to have sex, I don't mean it in that basic sense, but like, what makes you feel passionate about your own body and excited about your own body and what you do with it or someone else's body, like, and what clothes you feel comfortable in and that are true to your own gender identity, like those kind of things, which I would say are all in the bubble of like sexuality, are very individualized. Like, that makes you an individual and that makes you unique. And that is dangerous to people who are trying to control you as an individual and control a collective group of people. And so definitely, I think thinking about like going back to the LGBTQ plus community, I'm not going to speak to the nuance of the history of the queer community and how they have developed throughout history and how they've been viewed in the public eye. But I would say that something that was very scary and made people uncomfortable is because they were expressive in a way that people weren't used to or didn't experience themselves, or if they did, they were repressing that. And I don't know, I'll take an example that I can speak to as a queer person, like being a feminine woman. I have a feminine gender expression, and dating another woman who has a gender expression that is also more feminine. But, can't talk about my partner's gender expression for her, but like, we are both women, and someone who's never seen two more feminine women kissing, for example, that's uncomfortable because we're expressing ourselves in a way that is individual and is unique and could be labeled as inherently sexual, even if that's not what it is. And so I feel like what I'm trying to get at is that sex just is individualized and sexuality is individualized, and that's like very anti what this world that they are living in wants. Even Winston thinks about sex. He thinks about having sex with Julia. He thinks about murdering Julia because he thinks about having sex with her. And that is dangerous, because that's independent thought, and that is thinking about like what would make you feel physically fulfilled. And I just thought that was a really interesting theme throughout the book. And in a way, I think sex is a form of resistance, And I wrote that on this page.
Do you see it as... So do you mean that as sex is a form of resistance specifically in the context of this book, or do you think that sex is a form of resistance in real life?
Yes, to both. Before we continue this conversation, because I feel like I just yapped a bit in a way that was a little disjointed, but I wanted to read the parts of this page that I had bracketed. And so it says, in the old days, he thought, Winston, he obviously, a man looked at a girl's body and saw that it was desirable, and that was the end of the story. But you could not have pure love or pure lust nowadays. No emotion was pure because everything was mixed up with fear and hatred. Their embrace had been a battle, the climax of victory. It was a blow struck against the party. It was a political act. That speaks to it being resistance. But in this book, in the context of this book, and it also says the animal instinct, the simple, undifferentiated desire, that was the force that would tear the party to pieces. And I think that it's really interesting because being comfortable in your own body and what you want to do with your body, and knowing what you like about someone else's body and about their person and about their individuality, that is something that requires a lot of independent and powerful thought. And so that's a form of resistance to the party in this world, because it's very anti exactly what they want.
Yeah. I think that if you want any evidence at all of the fact that sex of any form is a political act or can be viewed in a political sense, you just have to look at the ways in which sex has been viewed anytime a more totalitarian government has been installed. And so I think that this is just reflective of reality, and it's looking at the ways in which sex has been treated during totalitarian regimes, specifically during the reign of Stalin, and stuff like that, where anytime a government is seeking to expand the degree to which it's controlling the population, that is almost exactly met with a cracking down on sex as a whole, and also cracking down of what forms of sex are acceptable and what forms of sex are going to be labeled as degeneracy or things along those lines. So yeah, I definitely agree with you that I believe in this book, sex can definitely be seen as a stand-in for self-expression and the fulfilling of needs and desires and wants. And we can see that reflected in reality as well. I just think sexual freedom is the opposite of control. Freedom is the opposite of control, but well said.
Yeah, and I think Winston at some point says I hate purity, I hate goodness, I want everyone to be corrupt to the bones, and I just think that's a really interesting theme, and I think it reflects the real world as well. And if you want another literary example, there's also The Handmaid's Tale, which very clearly shows how sex is heavily controlled in that world and is once again for the purpose of creating children and nothing more. And I think I only point to queerness and that community that I'm also in because I think it's a very clear example of something that has been seen as corrupt because of the sexual freedom that exists within the community, because people who seek to control either themselves or control a group of people are uncomfortable when there is more freedom in sex.
So this kind of dovetails a little bit into a point that I wanted to talk about, which was more of I want to ask you as a woman this question, because I don't I have my opinions, but I don't feel as though I would be as equipped to answer it as you would. Is this book misogynistic? Because it feels as though the way in which it treats Winston and the way in which it treats Julia is very clearly different. And it feels like it could be interpreted in a way in which Julia is just a mindless drone who is acting on her base instincts. Like, it actually has the quote in there where Winston accuses her of being a rebel only from the waist down. And I'm curious if you believe that that is a reflection of the world that they live in, having misogynistic overtones, or do you think that the book and George Orwell himself is saying something at least tangentially misogynistic?
Good question. So the book was, published in 1949? Is that what
I think that's right.
said last week? So can a man living in the mid-1900s exist without having any sort of misogynistic ideals, even if it's in a microaggression way? I don't know if that can apply. I don't know if that term can apply to misogyny, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
I think so.
Even if George Orwell himself didn't believe that he was misogynistic and tried not to be, could he truly not be? I don't know. And so I feel like that's my first thought, is that maybe there were some inherent biases he had. And yes, they're talked about differently in the book, Winston versus Julia, that's very clear. But I also think, in defense of George Orwell or of this portrayal, I think it's also trying to juxtapose someone who somewhat remembers life before the party and someone who was born into it and never has known anything else, grew up as a junior spy and then became a member of the Junior Anti-Sex League, and then Julia's never known anything that wasn't this world. And so she doesn't have anything to cling to in the past of it could be like this. All she knows is she doesn't like the way it is, and she wants to do her best to enjoy her life while she's alive. It doesn't really, ultimate change in the future is not a goal of hers, because change to what, she has nothing to compare it to. So I don't know, with that in mind, I don't know if misogyny is the intention.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if asked directly anybody would ever say that misogyny was the intention of what they were doing. That feels like a really tough stance to take. But that was a critique of the book that I felt could be made and had seen other people make, and I just wanted to see what your thoughts on it were.
I think at face value, it's misogynistic, but I think it's a bit more complex than that, and so I didn't take offense to it, but I can see how someone might take offense to it, I guess, is what I'm saying. It could have just very well been the reverse. It could have been a woman. Winston could have been a woman in this world, and Julia could have been a man born into the world. And would he have written the story the same way in that case? I don't know.
I feel like the story itself would be different. It would be telling a completely different story, because I feel like if you wanted to accurately reflect the status that the different sexes have under authoritative regimes, it only makes sense that if one of the two was going to get the preferential treatment from O'Brien of I'm going to specifically torture you to try and change your mind, it feels like it has to be the man. Just like I said, from historical norms of the ways in which those parties have operated in the past and the way that they operate today.
also O'Brien was misogynistic. Like, he spoke directly to Winston. He gave the book to Winston. He didn't really acknowledge Julia nor care that she was there.
Yeah. Speaking of O'Brien, I'll let you decide. Do you want to talk about the use of NewSpeak in the book first and like discuss NewSpeak and how that is mirrored today, or do you want to talk about like the overarching message that George Orwell has by talking about the book itself and talking about Goldstein's chapter?
NewSpeak.
I think that's good because it probably makes sense to save the big picture stuff to the end. So I would love to talk about NewSpeak because NewSpeak is fascinating to me, and I think that this plays into what we were talking about with sex, of ways in which populations are manipulated and controlled. I think that the way in which sex in this book is treated is an obvious example of a very direct means of control, like a physical means of control, restraining people from being able to act in the way that they typically would like to act or would tend to act. Whereas I think NewSpeak plays the role of preventing people from acting not through physical means or physical restraints, but preventing them from acting in a way that you want by preventing them from thinking in a way that you don't want. And so the book itself has a whole appendix that is dedicated specifically to NewSpeak. And if that in and of itself is not evidence enough that NewSpeak is incredibly important in this book, then I don't know what is. But I wanted to read this little part of the appendix that kind of talks about the concept of NewSpeak as a whole, where it says, "The purpose of NewSpeak was not only to provide a medium of expression for the worldview and mental habits proper to the devotees of Ingsoc, but to make all other modes of thought impossible. It was intended that when NewSpeak had been adopted once and for all, and Old Speak forgotten, a heretical thought, that is, a thought diverging from the principles of Ingsoc, should be literally unthinkable, at least so far as thought is dependent on words." And then it goes on to talk about the way in which NewSpeak intends to make that happen, specifically by dividing language into different vocabularies and overall trying to, number one, reduce the total amount of words in the language, because if you don't have as many words, then you can't express as nuanced of a thought. If the only word that you have for nature is outside, then it becomes a lot more difficult for you to express the nuance between a mountain and a river. Similarly, at the same time as reducing the number of words, it's also attempting to reduce the meanings that words can have. So instead of one word like free being allowed to mean unbonded while also meaning has no cost, at this point free only has one meaning. I find this really interesting, and I find it interesting when comparing it to modern day life, because I think that there are a lot of examples in which big, complex ideas, for the sake of political purposes, have been boiled down to specific words or phrases that are then able to communicate broad ideas without having to resort to the language that would otherwise be required to express them. So specifically, I'm thinking woke. Being able to use the word woke to describe everything left-leaning or everything that has to do with inclusivity and diversity and acceptance, like being able to boil all of your dislike for that political ideology down into the single word of woke allows people who oppose that to communicate what they believe without having to actually detail, I oppose equal rights. They don't have to say that. They just have to say, I'm fighting woke.
And it makes it more digestible to the people they're trying to reach. Like, you can just put the label woke on anything, and the people who support the right, I guess, will just be like, oh, yeah, hate that, it's woke. When they don't know the details, they don't know what it means. And it's also, it's more digestible to hear, like, that's woke and we don't like it, than it is to hear, we don't support equal rights for every person. Like, that's a little, you know?
Yeah. I think that doublethink is essentially a stand-in for cognitive dissonance, which I believe that a lot of people who would subscribe to the idea of being anti-woke would have issues with cognitive dissonance if it were not for being able to put their beliefs into these almost dog whistle like words or catch-all words like woke, where instead of having to say, oh, I am a Christian and I believe that you should love everybody and treat everybody as yourself and love your neighbor as yourself, but also I hate these specific groups of people and think that they shouldn't exist. You can still say those two things by dividing them between believing that everybody should be treated equally on one part of your brain, and then the other part is that you're just anti-woke. And you don't have to delve too deeply into what you actually mean when you think and say that.
Sorry, we're delving into Emmanuel Goldstein's book a bit here with this, but it says in the section of the book that is part of Emmanuel Goldstein's book, it says, doublethink lies at the very heart of Ingsoc, since the essential act of the party is to use conscious deception while retaining the firmness of purpose that goes with complete honesty. And I remember when I read that, I read it like 5 times, and I was like, what? But, like, if you, at your core, you know that you have these two beliefs, but you believe them both to be completely true and completely honest, and you don't recognize the dissonance of those two thoughts. You just hold them both.
Yeah, because it's uncomfortable to have cognitive dissonance. Like, it's uncomfortable to be confronted with the fact that you have inherently contradictory ideas in your head at the same time. And so by being able to reduce that discomfort while maintaining the ferociousness with which people are believing what you want them to believe, that can only serve to benefit you by making it more and more palatable to believe the thing that would otherwise be uncomfortable to confront.
Yeah. And on that same page it says, like, even using the word doublethink requires you to use doublethink.
Yeah.
So even consider cognitive dissonance would require cognitive dissonance, and all of that's uncomfortable and confusing. And so I think, like, it's interesting, a lot of the members of the inner party exercise doublethink constantly, but do they really use the word doublethink to? No, I think people like Winston are using doublethink, or the people who are creating NewSpeak, like, I forgot his name, but he's in the early part of the book, he's a friend of Winston's, and he ends up getting unpersoned, but he is one of the people who's helping, like, rewrite language, and he might use that word because he's very involved with the language. But a lot of people, I don't think, really use it. They don't really think about doublethink. It just is.
Yeah.
Before we get into, I'm sure you have specific things in Emmanuel Goldstein's book that you wanted to talk about. I did have one thing. I wanted to talk about the proles.
Yeah.
I think there was, like, a lot of things I thought about the proles. It actually baffles me a bit that they allow the proles to exist, but then at the same time they allow the proles to exist because they are
the exploited class, essentially.
Yeah, there has to be an exploited class in any well, that's what Emmanuel Goldstein says.
Yeah.
In any society, there's the low class. And I don't know, there's several thoughts like I underlined throughout thinking about it. Like I think Winston felt like a lot of hope lie with the proles. Lie. Grammar. But unfortunately the proles didn't have the resources to understand the position they were in. They didn't have the education. They didn't have, he tried talking with them. He tried spending time in the places they were, and it wasn't successful. Like when he tried to have a conversation with this man, like the man just kind of responded unintelligibly, and he was like, our hope, they're the ones who, I wanted to find the spot that I underlined.
I think that part of what you were discussing, I had underlined, at least referring to the necessity for the proles in terms of the distribution of wealth within the society, where in the book it says, if it once became general, wealth would confer no distinction. It was possible, no doubt, to imagine a society in which wealth, in the sense of personal possession and luxuries, should be evenly distributed while power remained in the hands of a small privileged caste. But in practice, such a society could not long remain stable. So essentially, like, the necessity for the proles to be a subjugated class was because if they were not, then they would have the means to overthrow the power. If you don't regulate who has wealth, it becomes difficult to regulate who has power.
I think, yeah. And I think it's really interesting, though, because the proles, I found the part I wanted to talk about. On top of that, the proles retain a sense of humanity that no one else and in the party has.
Yeah.
Allegedly. And so it says Winston's just kind of like, he's just kind of thinking. And, Winston thinks a lot. And he says, they were governed by private loyalties which they did not question. What mattered were individual relationships and a completely helpless gesture. An embrace, a tear, a word spoken to a dying man could have value in itself. The proles, it suddenly occurred to him, had remained in this condition. So he's talking about people before Ingsoc, and now the proles are the same. They were not loyal to a party or a country or an idea. They were loyal to one another. The proles had stayed human. And I think it's really interesting that they, the inner party, Big Brother, whoever, allow the proles to stay that way. And I guess I want to ask you why you think that is. Like, what do you think how does that benefit the society?
I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe that this is a reflection of George Orwell's belief that the working class, without the proper prompting, has a tough time being able to free itself from the pressures that the ruling class is putting on it. And so essentially, like, I think that in the context of the book, the reason why the proles exist the way that they do are because the party does not view them as a threat.
Yeah.
Now, why the party does not view them as a threat is, there's a lot of philosophical reasons that you could go behind that as to what it is that Orwell is trying to say, but I interpret it as being, while a broad sweeping working class revolution is the only effective way to redistribute the power from the hands that control it, the odds of that type of action occurring without some sort of outside influence is relatively low, because working class people are, by necessity, incredibly concerned with just getting by. Like, if the only thing that you have the capacity to worry about is where you're next going to eat or paying rent or things like feeding your children, the concept of trying to upend society to try and install a different system in place is incredibly daunting. And also, like, who has the time? It's Monday. I've got to get to work.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking kind of about what we talked about last week, and you mentioned this. Like, George Orwell spent a lot of time with working class people or with people who were homeless, and I just wonder if that influenced the way he portrayed the proles in this book, and I think it did. And
yeah.
I think, in a way, though, there are times when I felt like he sensationalized the proles. One thing I thought of, which I think it's true that a lot of art and culture and beauty and music have come out of oppressed classes of people in the past. But there's a line that I don't know, I thought it was really interesting, and I don't know how I felt about it, but it says perhaps it was only when people were somewhere near the starvation level that they had anything to sing about, because Winston was listening to a prole woman outside the window of the room that he and Julia stay in. He was listening to her sing and thought that. And I don't know, I was thinking about the way that the proles were like romanticized and sensationalized a bit, like the beauty of their poverty and how they, and I don't know, I felt a little uncomfortable sometimes when I thought about it, and I was like, is that because of his experiences that he had with people? I don't know if what I'm trying to say is coming across clearly, but
it does feel and read to me similarly to the way in which he experienced the lower classes and like lower socioeconomic classes in Paris and London, which is as somebody who comes from money, engaging with those people not at face value necessarily. Like, it feels like a romanticizing of the working class conditions that these people were put under as viewed from somebody who is themselves removed from the working class. Like, it makes me think a lot of Orson Welles, who was a filmmaker, if you're not familiar, a very, very successful filmmaker who grew up in poverty and spent most of his life without a tremendous amount of money. And at one point during an interview later in his life, he was asked if he believed that the time in which he was impoverished helped him to be a better artist. And his response was absolutely not. That the only thing that poverty does is take away from you. It does not grant you with the ability to create just because you've experienced it. It just takes away the means by which you would have otherwise been able to create something.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, I think that line reminded me of like slave songs and songs that came out of people working the fields and when they were enslaved, and it was like, oh, at least this beautiful music came out of it. It's like, whoa. Like, they could have made that music anywhere. Didn't have to be in a field.
In fact, if they had been in a position where they were more comfortable in their lives, they would have been more able to make music and do these things. Like, it's not through your suffering that you become an artist.
Yeah.
I think that before we wrapped up, I did want to talk about just what the interpretation of the book as a whole is, because I think that I touched on it in the last episode, where I believe that pretty regularly this book is interpreted to be anti-communist and anti-socialist because of the phraseology and the word choice that's used in the party itself. Whereas I believe that particularly if you're looking at Goldstein's chapter and you're looking at Orwell's history as a person and all of the themes and elements of the book, I believe that they point pretty strongly towards being pro-socialist or at the very least being anti-totalitarianism. And there was a specific quote that I wanted to read about from Orwell regarding why a lot of the terminology within the book references communism, which is where he said that 1984 was, quote, based chiefly on communism because that is the dominant form of totalitarianism, but I was trying chiefly to imagine what communism would be like if it were firmly rooted in an English-speaking countries and was no longer a mere extension of the Russian Foreign Office. So he later on, like at a different point, and I'm pretty sure that I quoted this last week, where he said that everything that he wrote after the Spanish Civil War, which this was written after the Spanish Civil War, was directly or indirectly written against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism. So it's not an anti-communist book so much as I would say it's an anti-Stalinist book. It's an anti-totalitarian book, regardless of the form. Like, it's not like George Orwell just does not like when the government tries to take all of the power within itself as opposed to distributing that power amongst the people. Did you have any overarching thoughts that you wanted to add to it?
Yeah, no, I very much agree with that. I think that section, Emmanuel Goldstein's section of the book, is, I agree, is a chore to read and isn't particularly fun to read. I mean, I don't know if I'd describe any of this book fun to read, honestly. Maybe a little bit in the beginning / Julia section when they're kind of falling in love, which I actually don't think that they're in love, but that's not important, really. I think it's just they have a connection that isn't able to exist in that world, and so it feels special. It's difficult to read, but I think I agree that like really speaks to what George Orwell believes, and I think something we talked about with Amada's proposal is like there's always a section of often a section of satire feature where it's like, this is what I actually think, and this is what, and I think that is that section.
Yeah. I think that something that trips people up when they're reading satire who are not familiar with it is the fact that the people who are by the society pointed towards as the bad guys generally are not the bad guys as far as the author is concerned. Like, something that I was thinking about while reading a different satire book for an upcoming episode is that in a satire book, the author thinks everybody is stupid and wrong except for the protagonist. The way in which everybody else is just going along with society and what society is doing as a whole, that is what the author is critiquing, and the main character's resistance, or any resistance within the book, to that ideology and society, that's what the author actually believes. And so this chunk in the middle that's just a sociology textbook that is anti-totalitarianism and pro-socialism, that's what George Orwell actually believes. But yeah, I agree that it's not necessarily fun to read that section because it is just a sociology chapter.
Yeah. A couple things. One thing I underlined. I have two things. I'll give you a choice. One is from Emmanuel Goldstein, but it's comparing today's political climate in America to this book. That's the first one, which we've done to an extent already, but there's one thing I underlined. And then the other thing is about collective memory.
Let's go with the first one. I think that's more interesting.
Okay. All right, so I underlined in the Ignorance is Strength section of Emmanuel Goldstein's book, the heirs of the French, English, and American revolutions had partly believed in their own phrases about the rights of man, freedom of speech, equality before the law, and the like, and had even allowed their conduct to be influenced by them to some extent. But by the fourth decade of the 20th century, all the main currents of political thought were authoritarian. and something I've been thinking about a lot in the current American political climate. And if you're not American, you don't live in America, if you want to turn on the fast forward part of this, because if you don't care, I mean, you might care. I think it's impacting the whole world potentially. I don't know. But I've been thinking about how the current American administration labels themselves as patriots and people who they're like pro-America, you know? We are American, we love America, we want to make America great. But something I've been seeing a lot recently, especially in younger people on social media who are not in support of the current administration or more left-leaning or more liberal, is them being like, what do you mean you're a patriot? You say you love this country, but I don't feel like you do. I love this country. This country was founded on freedom and liberty and justice for all. This country was founded on freedom of speech and freedom of press. And this country was founded on individual rights and equality. And so, you know, make whatever argument you want about the founding fathers of America. But in general, I think this idea that America was founded by revolutionists, and that's what it says just now in this book, the early revolution, and I'm just talking about the American section of that paragraph. And it's interesting to me that the current right-leaning administration has leaned away from these original ideas of the country, because what they are doing does in a way reflect authoritarianism. And I'm not saying we're in this total authoritarian regime, but they're doing a lot of things that are not very liberty and justice for all. It's not giving liberty and justice for all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to the ideas of like the double think and the cognitive dissonance, where it's like saying that you want to return to the roots of America. And like, obviously, like, I feel like it should go without saying, America has a very racist past in general and a very unequal past in general. And so even if you are saying that you want to return to the roots of American culture, you're returning to a time period of slavery and oppression and all of that kind of stuff. But the baseline ideas of we believe in the First Amendment rights, but we're going to arrest protesters. We believe in the freedom of the press, but we're going to defund press that disagrees with our standpoint. Like,
we're going to bar the press from covering things if they don't print what we want. And it's just, I think that was such an interesting paragraph. I remember when I read it, I was like, is this a prophecy? Because it said, like, originally a lot of revolutionists who founded countries that exist today, exist at the time that George Orwell was writing this book, were founded on this sense of equality and this sense of freedom. But now we've moved in the world that Winston is in, moved towards authoritarianism. And why that is, in this book, I could talk about why that is. In the world we're currently living in, I don't know. If I knew, then maybe I'd feel less anxious every day. But maybe I wouldn't. And I just thought that was an interesting parallel.
Yeah, I think that whenever you're looking at books like this that are from the 40s and the 50s or earlier, and they feel remarkably prescient for the lives that we have to live and the issues that we deal with today, it works as a point in favor of the idea that history repeats itself and that time is a flat circle, where these are problems that have existed for a long time and will likely continue to exist and re-arise over and over and over again. And unfortunately, it just so happens that right now we are lining up with a world in which somebody could write another 1984, that in 100 years' time, people are picking up and saying, wow, how did they predict all of this?
Yeah. I think it's just true to satire in general, that while it might be exaggerated, it reflects things that authors have observed in the real world, and they want to make commentary on that in a way that is differently digestible than the real world.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't say it better myself. So before we move on to our footnotes for the episode, I think that it would be wise for us to go through and discuss our 5 bookmarks of satire. These are like the 5 metrics by which we judge satire books, because these are like the 5 hallmark ideas that exist within most satirical works to some degree or another. As a brief overview, those are humor, irony, exaggeration, ridicule, and criticism or criticizing. And we're just going to go through one by one and say very briefly if we think that the book uses this element in order to convey its ideas. So I'll start off with humor. Not a lot.
No, it's not very funny.
No, I think that you could interpret it as darkly comedic at points, but it's not really trying to make you laugh.
Yeah, I think we've said before we can't really propose on intention of an author that is not alive anymore. But if I were to, I would think that, no, I don't think George Orwell was inherently trying to be funny.
No, he's trying to shock you. Number 2, irony. Saying one thing but meaning the opposite, kind of like tongue-in-cheek commentary. I also don't think that there's a tremendous amount of irony.
Yeah, I don't really think so either. I would say that there's a bit. I don't know. I don't want to.
Yeah. I think that one's like a half point for irony. The next one, I believe, is one of the 2 that it absolutely does, which is exaggeration.
Yeah, it's very...
This is taking all of the ideas that it can and pushing them to the furthest possible extent. Like, it's taking the idea of the government surveilling its citizens and turning that into every single room of every person's house has a camera in it that is watching you all the time. Like, it's doing more exaggeration than it is most other things, I believe.
I absolutely think that exaggeration is maybe the second most prevalent of the bookmarks. And obviously, this is a very... Yeah, never mind. I think you covered it, probably.
Yeah, and so number 4 is going to be ridicule. This is another one I don't think it really does a lot of, because it doesn't make fun of the people for their beliefs. It's more wanting you to be angry at these people than find them to be ridiculous.
Yeah, I actually don't think it ridicules. Like, I'm trying to think of an example where it does do that.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it does.
But what it does do a lot of is criticism. It does a lot of criticizing. It's taking what is the popular form of government of the day with, like, well, not popular, but it's taking totalitarianism and it is providing a lot of criticism for it. I think that a not insignificant amount of that criticism comes through the form of the Emmanuel Goldstein chapter of directly, like, point by point laying out the ways in which it believes that this government is corrupt and wrong and all those kinds of things. But I think, except for criticism is the number 1 bookmark that it's hitting.
Yeah. I mean, I think Winston in general is just a walking... His thoughts are a critique of this world and the government, and therefore of the current political climate in the world that George Orwell was living in. Like, Winston does nothing but think about how much he hates the world.
Yeah. So that leaves us with, it gets a firm 2 out of 5 on the bookmark scale, like a 2.5 really, which I thought was interesting because we have 5 bookmarks and then maybe the most popular or most famous satirical book of all time is only getting 2.5, but it's leaning so heavily into those that it makes up the ground where it's missing the rest, I guess.
Yeah. I think when we get to some Kurt Vonnegut, we'll get some more bookmarks. I feel like.
Yeah. Yeah. Kurt's hitting all of them.
Oh, yeah, no, definitely.
So with that, I think that we can move on to our actual like reviews, like star reviews of the book. But before we hear our reviews, let's hear some reviews from you guys. And by you guys, what I mean is going on to Goodreads and searching for 1-star reviews to see from the people who absolutely hated this book. Because that, I think that we can do the inverse of whatever we feel about the book, and I feel like both of us generally like this book. So looking at 1-star reviews is interesting, whereas in the future, if we really dislike a book, maybe looking at 5-star reviews to see why people really like it would be interesting. So I've got a couple of 1-star reviews that I've found, and I'm going to read one myself, and I'm going to send one over to Sydney for her to read and see why people dislike 1984.
This review was left by Christy in 2012. We don't know Christy, no hate to Christy. We love them. Maybe we haven't read their review yet, but please don't find Christy on Goodreads and send hate. So Christy said, "Praise the Lord and pass the ammunition. I am finished with this beast of a book. My brain feels like sludge. I just want to crawl into a hole and forget all that was ingrained into my poor head. Why, oh why, did I have the noble idea to read such a monster? After reading this, it just makes you feel hopeless. Hallelujah, it's over. Never again, Orwell. Never again." Side note, I did experiment on Facebook about this book. I wrote it in my status that I was reading 1984. Anyone have any opinions? Almost everyone of the commenters wrote how much they enjoyed this book and how it was one of their favorite books ever. Well, I'm sure that maybe one of them was being truthful. I have to doubt at least half of them. Now I ask, why do people lie about certain books? Do they think it makes them look smarter, cooler, well-rounded? I just don't get it. If you don't like something, you don't like it. It's not necessary to like it for classic book's sake. This might not be making sense to some of you. Maybe you would have to know the people who were commenting. I don't know. But I am sure all of you have been in a bookstore talking with a coworker and they spout out some well-known hip book that they just adore. You know this person, and it's hard to see them reading, period, much less what they are talking about. Christy's gaslighting everyone who's ever enjoyed a classic book.
Christy's saying, I don't know about y'all, but I have some dumbass friends, and there's no shot they're reading.
Christy's such a hater. I love it. I guess my point is, don't be a fake book talker. Like it? Yay. Don't like it? Yay. I'm not going to think less of you for not liking something you should like by literary standards. That's hilarious. Honestly, I'm on Christy's side. I mean, I don't hate this book, but I get it.
Yeah, I think that she's making some really strong points. I think that it's crazy to look at a book that's like 300 total pages and call it like a monster of a book. Like, it's not that much of a book. Mm-hmm. But I do agree I think that there's a lot of people who say they've read 1984 who have not read 1984. And why are you lying?
Yeah, there's probably, I think that there's maybe a sense in the like world of book readers that you should have read some books. Like, there are just Hallmark books that are like, oh, these are classics, you should have read them. And you don't have to read them. You don't have to read 1984. Just listen to our podcast. You don't have to read.
Exactly. That's what we're here for.
Also, I do agree that it does make you feel hopeless. So, I mean, if you don't want to feel hopeless as a reader, then maybe you would hate this book. And yeah, so that's fair.
So the review that I've got here is from Stephen M. Stephen M. leaves a 1-star review for 1984 and says, "My main issue at the time was Stephen is referring to a previous review that they wrote. I'm skipping a fair amount of this because Stephen is very long-winded. But my main issue at the time was that the book wanted to argue about these political ideas through a story, and it left me wondering why a story was even necessary in the first place. I think I was pretty reductive in my approach to works that combine artistic expression and politics. However, I thought that if the author really wanted to convey a point about a political or social issue, why not resort to the good old syllogism or debate format? I think the answer to this should be obvious. It should make me look blatantly provocative for having made that point. The reason why it's a book is because it has reached such a wider audience as a work of fiction than if it were a political essay, which would probably only reach a handful of those in academia and those working in that field of study. I'd like to hear 1984 written from the perspective of Big Brother. The dynamics of government control, and the temptation of power is what most interests me the most. I think it's easy for us, mere individuals and lowly citizens at the bottom of the food chain, to abstract a single oppressive entity, the single Big Brother, which has its own motivations and intentions acting as its own agent which oppresses us. But this misses out on a large portion of the truth. Any oppressive system came about from a large, complicated set of cause and effects, which makes it difficult to point to any one person or party who is culpable. I'm sure all the reasons behind any given dictum or law are extremely complex, and this complexity has to render incomprehensible any abstracted notion of a singular entity with nefarious intentions behind it. I'd like to hear that story because I think that no matter which perspective you take on any difficult society-wide issue, it will be seen as us versus them. You'll never get to the real source of what causes all these problems and issues, no matter how the perspective changes, because you'll see it through the eyes of one person caught up in a society-wide issue. I think this was what Kafka was expressing through a lot of his work.
I bet Steven's really fun at parties.
Steven finishes the review with, "I'd like to read that part of 1984. Maybe Orwell will write a sequel."
When was this written? When was that review written?
May 7th, 2011.
When did George Orwell die?
1950.
Yeah. I mean, I knew it was before 2011, but... Oh.
Yeah.
I feel like
hey,
Steven
George,
started the review...
I've got a couple of notes.
I feel like Steven started the review by being like, I don't think satire should exist, first of all.
Yes. Steven started the review by saying, politics in my books, it should be an essay.
Steven clearly wanted to be in a political science classroom. And
Steven would love to debate you about 1984 right now. But those are your reviews. Now let's get into our reviews. I think we'll keep it relatively short, but I like this book. I think that for me, this book is a solid 4 out of 5. It drags at some points. I think that there are some absolutely valid critiques that can be made out of it, but it does do what it wants to do, and it sticks the landing. So for me, it's a 4 out of 5.
Yeah, it's 4 out of 5 for me as well. I will say that, like, from Emmanuel Goldstein's book, while it's very important to the end of the book, it's kind of like, oh my god, this is moving so slowly, and so it's hard to get through. And I think that's a valid critique that someone might make. I myself would make it, but I also see the value in it as like someone who's reading it analytically. But yeah, I think I agree. Like, it does its job. It's an excellent example of a critique of a society and a political ideology. And, you know, Winston's a fun character. Winston's an interesting character. Julia's also an interesting character. And I think that they are well developed for what they are. Like, if you were putting this up against a different fiction novel, you might be like, oh, these characters suck. But they're not aiming to be a literary fiction character. So
yeah, awesome. So that leaves us with a Satire Fire 4-star book. Not quite a certified banger of consensus 5-star, but a consensus pretty good book.
Yeah, pretty good.
Sydney, do you want to tell people where they can find us and follow us should they choose to?
Okay, great. Well, thank you guys for listening to our first full analysis episode. We hope you enjoyed it. It might be a bit longer than the previous episodes, which, makes sense because there's a bit more depth to the conversation in these episodes. But in the future, if a book's really long, we will split it up into more than one analysis episode, and we won't keep you here all night or all day or all morning, whenever you listen to your podcasts. But if you enjoyed this podcast, please go over to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcast, and give us a review, give us 5 stars or however many stars you want to give us. And you can follow us on social media at the Satire Fire on TikTok and Blue Sky. You can also find us on Instagram at the Satire Fire Pod, Pod. Unfortunately, we don't have that name yet. Maybe ever. We'll see. If you want to contact us outside of social media, you can send us a DM there, or you can send us an email at thesatirefirepodcast@gmail.com.
Awesome. So that does it for us for this week. The next week, you can find us here. We are starting a new series, a series that Sydney is going to be covering. Sydney, do you want to tell them what book you have chosen as the next Satire Fire book?
Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. And if you remember from our historical context episode, George Orwell and Aldous Huxley knew each other, so
yeah,
that's
a little bit of a crossover. So that's going to do it for us this week. I have been Samuel.
And I have been Sydney, no longer, but I'm Sydney.
And don't forget to go visit your local library.
Thanks for listening to the Satire Fire.